Guatemala has had three U.S. military interventions since 1890. Now, the most notorious of these that kind of laid a blueprint for further U.S. Interference in varying countries that oppose U.S. hegemony is probably in 1954. Up until that time in Guatemala, the Guatemalan people had been under the heel of the U.S.-backed United Fruit Company. During that time period, you saw a number of agrarian laborers try to come together to resist these repressive actions, the highly exploitative work they would have to do at behest of the United Fruit Company. But they were all violently opposed by the United Fruit Company and the U.S.-backed dictator Jorge Ubico. For example, you would see chain gangs of prisoners being bandied about under this regime. So this caught the attention of a military officer, Colonel Arbenz, who ran a campaign in the 1950 elections of Guatemala, and he defeated his nearest challenger by a margin of over 50%. He took office in March of 1951 and enacted a number of social reforms, such as expanding the right to vote, the ability of workers to organize, legitimizing political parties, and allowing public debate. The most important of his policy agenda was probably Decree 900, otherwise known as the Agrarian Reform Law. It redistributed unused lands of sizes greater than 224 acres to local peasants, and it compensated landowners with government bonds. Land from at most 1,700 estates was redistributed to about 500,000 families, which is 1/6 of the country's population. Now, this is important. The policies by Arbenz were by no means something we could call communist. They were relatively social democratic reforms that were trying to move Guatemala into a situation where they could break these even pre-capitalist chains that they were beholden to because of various U.S.-backed dictators and policies in the region. But these policies ran afoul of the United Fruit Company, and so they lobbied the U.S. to have him overthrown. In the 1954 Guatemalan coup d'etat, which was engineered by the United States Department of State and the CIA, Arbenz was overthrown and replaced by Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, who was a very brutal dictator in his wake. Now, I wanted to mention regarding the 54 coup d'etat, part of why it went off without a hitch and was so successful is because within the United States, there was this figure by the name of Edward Bernays. He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he's known as the pioneer of what we now call public relations or PR and propaganda. And Edward Bernays, he helped manufacture the consent necessary that would allow for a successful coup d'etat of the democratically elected Colonel Arbenz. He actually helped create something called the Middle America Information Bureau. The United Fruit Company financed this bureau, which provided information to the newspapers about the so-called communist penetration in Guatemala. It's important to note that Arbenz himself, again, was more of a democratic socialist. Of course, on this show, Mike and I are avowed communists, but even someone like Arbenz, who really was aiming for more of a non-aligned status of his country, just the mere instance of land and wealth redistribution was seen as such a threat to U.S. hegemony that this led to a concerted effort among all echelons of the United States government to overthrow a democratically elected leader. So Bernays helps stand up this Middle America Information Bureau. It distributes what one might call fake news to a number of agencies and creates a wide public outcry that Arbenz is this brutal communist dictator. Again, as I said, he was overthrown, and this leads to a number of various situations of political turmoil in Guatemala, which Mike will go into in a minute. But I just want to mention this part of Bernays because Bernays' method, his methods are still very much used today. And to show you just how sordid his methodologies were, his books were read by figures such as Goebbels, of course, of the Nazi regime, because they were so effective at creating a false image of the real information in society and controlling masses of people to do the bidding of empire. Adam Curtis has an excellent documentary called The Century of the Self from 2002 that kind of goes into the situation. But the Guatemalan people suffer under the regime that comes after Arbenz, and then this continues on into the 80s, which Mike is going to discuss now.
That's right. And, that intervention that the CIA orchestrated in 1954 with the nationalization of the United Fruit Company, with bombings, the coup, all that that Spencer mentioned, 200,000 people or more were killed in that time period. That's such a massive loss of life to defend United Fruit Company. It's literally, there is no other rationale except to defend United Fruit Company. But, that's quite indicative of U.S. policy for centuries up until now. But, in the 1980s, the U.S. backed a dictator named Carlos Montt. Ronald Reagan himself said Carlos Montt was a great man who was doing something great for the country of Guatemala. Montt oversaw what was dubbed a scorched earth policy, where predominantly the indigenous communities of Guatemala were the ones that were enemies of the state, particularly because of land rights, because indigenous people thought they had the right to the land that their people had been on for thousands of years, and the fruit companies thought that it was their land. And so Carlos Montt just oversaw the massacre of these people. He wiped out 90% of indigenous communities, this Ronald Reagan-backed dictator named Carlos Montt in the 80s. There is some kind of justice in this situation. In 2013, Montt became the first Latin American leader to be convicted of genocide. But of course, even though he was brought to justice and his scorched earth policy ended, people are still fleeing for their lives. And they are today. And many of the people in the caravan are people that are fleeing the types of violence that stayed. I did want to play a quick clip from someone else in that documentary named Maria. Maria came to the United States as a small child as a political refugee from Guatemala after her father was murdered, and then her mother was threatened with assassination as well.
My father, Jorge Alberto Rosal Paz y Paz, was disappeared on August 12, 1983. In 1985, 2 years after his disappearance, after an unrelenting search for my father, my mom too became a target for the military, and she made the difficult decision to leave the country. The counterinsurgency tactics that were used in Guatemala to silence the population really targeted anybody who opposed the government in any way, shape, or form. This means labor organizers who are trying to organize, educators who are, denouncing the educational system, or doctors who are accusing the government of being responsible for the high levels of malnutrition in the country, etc. So it was very easy to become a target. Anybody that opposed the government in any way could be targeted. Our family was essentially ripped apart because many of us had to flee to different places. We petitioned for asylum. My mom petitioned for asylum. I was 2 years old when I came to this country. My brother was 13 months. My mom petitioned for asylum. Our case was denied repeatedly, and we even had a deportation order at one point. And it was hard at this time because also remember, the United States is backing the civil wars that were occurring in Central America. So for a family or for anybody to receive asylum, not only do you have to have a well-founded fear of persecution, basically saying if I return to the country that I am fleeing from, I will die, I will be killed. The country you're fleeing to has to recognize this. And how inconvenient would that be for the United States Congress, the United States government that's funding and training and backing the very conflict we're fleeing from? You see this plight of refugees from Central America, 350,000 that came to the United States? Now that number is in the millions. And repeatedly, people are asking for asylum, petitioning for asylum because they're fleeing as a result of the impact of militarized U.S. foreign policy today. And many cases now, they're being deported, and many people in Central America who've had their asylum case denied are now being murdered in their country when they're deported.
So that was just Maria's story, and there are thousands and thousands of others just like her and on the caravan. And so all these interventions we just mentioned, the several in each of these countries, of course, in that past 100 years, there's actually been 56 U.S. military interventions in Latin America to determine the outcome of their government and who is going to rule. And so it's a long history of subverting people's right to self-determination, deciding their destiny for them. And so much of the violence and chaos there is a direct result of U.S. policy and willful actions. And that can't be separated from the current refugee crisis. And as much as they want to say none of those interventions were ever about democracy, it was always about protecting profits for U.S. capitalism. So that is the history that we have to tie in to what's happening with this migrant caravan. And, I think we need to be clear. I mean, whether or not they're coming in illegally, sneaking across the border, or whether they're coming in legally by declaring political asylum through a legal port of entry, it doesn't matter. We should welcome them. They're our brothers and sisters, and we should stand with them. They deserve our compassion. They deserve our support. And one of the ways we can support them is by fighting the forces of racism in our own government. If you are conflicted now about being in the military, that's because you have a heart, and you cannot let a false sense of duty convince you to do something that's morally wrong. So in short, don't be one of Trump's faithful patriots right now. Take the side of humanity and anti-racism. You are not alone, and we have your back.
Indeed, we have your back. Any type of resistance effort, I'm telling you, if you have even a few people on your side, it's much harder for those in power to suppress you and intimidate you. Join with your brothers and sisters within the ranks, outside of the ranks, those who are trying to come to this country. Find common cause with them, and you'll get back your humanity in a different kind of way, as I've always said. I want to leave us with a quote that's quite prescient from Colonel Arbenz, he himself a military man. And I figured, given the false claims against the migrant caravan, and given that we're trying to reach those in the military right now, that having someone who comes from a military background articulate such a statement would resonate. So this was from June 19th, 1954. And I quote Colonel Arbenz: "Our only crime consisted of decreeing our own laws and applying them to all without exception. Our crime is having enacted an agrarian reform which affected the interests of the United Fruit Company. Our crime is wanting to have our own route through the Atlantic, our own electric power, and our own docks and ports. Our crime is our patriotic wish to advance, to progress, to win economic independence to match our political independence. We are condemned because we have given our peasant population land and rights." So ponder those words, take to heart what Mike and I have discussed here today, and hopefully we'll see you on the other side. You've been listening to Eyes Left with Spencer Rapone
and Mike Preisner. All of our content is free for everyone, but we can't do it without your help. So if you support this project, go to patreon.com/eyesleft to make it possible to continue. Be sure to follow us on social media at Eyes Left Pod.
And if you're in the military, a military family member or veteran, and want to share your story, report problems and mismanagement, or need advice or assistance knowing your rights, including your right to get the hell out or refuse deployment, please write us at eyesleftpod@gmail.com.